Well, welcome to the Weird Rap Discussion Gang. We're doing something a little different this week. We got Chief and Nia, and we are discussing an essay by Carl Hancock Rux. It's called Eminem, the New White Negro. And there's just a lot of stuff to talk about in it. It's about race and culture and appropriation and all kinds of shit like that. So, yeah, I guess we're gonna just start. I'd like to start at the beginning actually, because I thought the first couple of quotes were interesting. It starts with the quote um, from the. It's a Hugo Ball quote, and it says, "From the Negro, we take only the magical liturgical bits, and only the antithesis makes them interesting to us." And I don't know if either you got much out of that. For me, it was really confusing, the language at first, but I feel like I made an interpretation of it, which I don't know is correct, but what I got out of that was it's saying that we, as in white people or not black people, take what we like from their culture, like the beautiful parts, the music, the art, the style, the vibe or whatever, and the antithesis makes that interesting to us, meaning like the ugly, the the ugliness of oppression, like when an oppressed people becomes often like desperate and violent and destitute, and that's what gives this their art and music like an extra edge. Does that ring true at all to either of you?
I wouldn't be able to necessarily speak from a stance of personal experience, but I could imagine that, yeah, it's sort of a voyeuristic tourist sort of like fascination with a certain culture or a certain like social status that you may be curious about, but you don't necessarily want to experience the fullness of it. So, we could cherry pick these aspects that we like, say that we're celebrating it through music or through art or whatever, and we're supporting creators, but at the same time, not have to face that reality like head on.
Hmm. Yeah, what I noticed about this essay was a lot of strong language, and that's not lost on me. And I like language, right? But liturgical refers to worship, and that's an interesting relationship for so-called former oppressors to share a history with what's often posed as an opposite. That we're still in the larger cultural narrative, we're encased in black and white. And I believe that part of, because we are speaking of American hip hop, at least, I'll just speak to that. But the idea that we have an art form that that almost comes entirely out of paradox, that the nature of destitution, loss, years of slavery, lack of education, there are all these aspects to the so-called Black individual, the Black American, that I think is confusing for it's confusing in the white narrative. And right, I mean, I don't know, I identify very strongly with Black culture, especially Black American culture. And the way this essay is posed is as a critique on the perhaps like a white participation in hip hop writ large, in rap music, the available platform, the lingo, the language, the behavior, is said to all come from, uh, the classic Negro or Black cultural body. Okay, that Black people from our experience manifest something cultural that can be taken and owned or picked at and claimed. Um, and he kind of he sort of starts off in a pretty, this is pretty hardcore to talk about worship, because that automatically means that we have there's a shift in power dynamic. um, and I think a lot of if you were to take the population of Black Americans, people might be hard pressed to say that they're worshipped. There might be some cultural language, there might be cultural narratives, American narratives, where we go, oh yeah, everybody steals from the Black person. The Black man is the most copied individual on the planet. Black woman is constantly imitated across the planet. It's true. But I think that's also the nature of culture. And that culture can inform people. And once you get that information, it's hard to forget it. And not to mention, American culture is quite diverse. And the idea that you have white Americans, let's say, or white people globally, because hip hop is all over the place. And you got folks in Poland or Czechoslovakia or, China who are very, very much into a Black cultural art form. But, you know, the hip hop individual exists to be worshipped in many ways, that there's a way that the MC just themselves are meant to give off an aura of being on top of the pile. And this is just hip hop traditionalism and not exclusive, but there's a long tradition in hip hop of being the God, right? The God MC. And that's someone you really can't, is even beyond reproach, transcendent to being stolen from. And hip hop kind of poses biters a very particular way when you think about it. So where he starts off here is he's kind of posing this relationship that I think exists in some forms, but there's really too much diversity in that relationship to classify it as worship. I wouldn't necessarily call it worship. I definitely would say that there's a captivation.
I feel like there is there's a certain type of fan. I don't know if I've been there. I think maybe I was more there in the past as a kid, worshiping my idols, whether they're rappers or superheroes or whatever. Maybe worship, we're using a different definition of that, where I just mean like really like, celebrating and thinking that they're like above human in a way, superhuman or something.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, I mean, I definitely think white people do that, and I think Black people do that too. At least that the kind of worship I'm talking about. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, I think people do that, put out the qualifier in front of it just because everybody sort of has their baseline, their aspirations, and then their characteristics that they try to avoid. And I think within looking at the world through that sort of like lens of comparison, you sort of naturally put certain individuals on a higher pedestal and are kind of dismissive about others. So, yeah, it really does come down to the definition of the word worship and how you approach it. But in some way, shape, or fashion, I think there is always a worship aspect in humanity.
Yeah, I think it's a, it's almost a part of American culture. It's intrinsic for us to worship in a way that a lot of cultures might have more history with. Because like liturgy, liturgy, that's biblical, that's, Abrahamic, that's having the script. And while I don't, reading into the text too much can kind of lead you astray to some degree, from an from a from a perspective of just being able to scope out an academic device. I'm seeing one. There's a maybe perhaps not a divisiveness yet, because it gets deeper as we get through this. But uh, yeah, I think culture is about worship, and we have ways of defining worship that really are perhaps divorced from what would be referred to as material acts, right? Like if you go to ashrams or temples, you watch people go through the same motion every day. They wake up the same side of the bed, clear their nostrils the same way. They go through the yoga positions, the same process. It's the process of being and becoming and actualizing, in other cultures. Um, to connect that back to the word, the usage of the word and how this is posed to the reader, um, I think that's true about white and Black Americans. I think white Americans do want to demonstrate their relationship with Black culture and the Black community through material acts. I think that those are cultural signifiers, in fact, and we actually have to be able, just again, if we were to make this a universal, I kind of don't, universals can get you into trouble because it's not everyone's experience, but you can say, that there's a possibility, and from all available evidence, that how anybody ingests culture becomes a form of material act. And if we were to kind of flip this conversation, if this hadn't been written about Eminem, we could have written it about Wu-Tang. We could have written it about how, RZA and Ray and all those cats' relationship with this visual component, going to movies and the kung fu, the karate, the words. That's all also, that's the same relationship. It's a very similar relationship. But the difference is that, the Asian population or Asian Americans, or if I were to be, so broad as just to say Asians, period. And I don't mean to be, just haphazardly inclusive, but, if I were to wrap it up, I would just say that they've never held so much political, cultural, and capital over the Black social cultural experience as the white culture has, the white Western culture has, and that we need to talk about it that's why we're talking about it, okay? Because if we were talking about what happens in Bed-Stuy or any number of areas in New York, for instance, birthplace of hip hop, for example, you would see a lot of urban people who delve into the culture, into what is intrinsically a Black cultural experience, without the kind of static and this relationship with, we wouldn't call it worship necessarily, right? When you learn cultural languages, you learn code. Those are codes. And it would be hard to participate, at least if we were just to look at the subject, Eminem, it would be hard for M to participate in the culture. It would be hard for any white American person marked by this paradoxical relationship with Black folks, who's supposed to be a person, land of the free, home of the brave, and all the liberty that's been sort of fused into the white experience. I think that, that's why this ends up being an important conversation. And what I noticed through this article or this sort of paper, what I would say is that I don't remember seeing Interscope mentioned once. And so if we're going to talk about worship and where to locate it, it's like, where do you locate this kind of like what, I don't know if I'm supposed to take this as like a slavish liturgical relationship, or is it a, you know, again, captivation, fascination? What is the nature of that relationship? But that, you know, it's the white folks in Interscope record that are actually more perhaps worshipful, if that makes sense. You know, even in the case of Black culture, sacrilegiously worshipful, let's say, okay? Like, it's not like they get it all right and worship it. They steal it and jack it and then sell it to you. So I would just, you know, the dimensions I think are worth looking into, because this is not something that I think we should ever take at face value. That people are just picking up an art form or a cultural artifact and you know, recapitulating it and perpetrating it, and you know, there's too much diversity and experience of people who listen to hip hop and engage in hip hop and rap, DJ, MC, the elements, the whole 9 yards. So anyway, guys, sorry, I don't mean to talk too much. I'm just
bringing up that Wu-Tang comparison is actually interesting too, and I hadn't even thought about it necessarily, but it does kind of frame it as a lateral worship versus like a hierarchical worship, which is what you're talking about, that power dynamic. And while it's not necessarily the main thing that Rux talks about, he does bring that factor in when he's talking about Eminem, because while culturally you would think it would be a hierarchical thing, his socioeconomic status is what makes his supposed worship lateral, and then
mm-hmm.
and that's the validating factor per se, you know.
Not to dwell so much on the very first quote in this essay, but what the one other thing, like, just to divorce race from it again, and the term worship, like, to me, what I thought was interesting was how it was saying kind of like people are attracted to the beauty of hip hop because of the danger that's associated with the people in hip hop. You know what I'm saying? Like, a flower becomes more special when it's growing out of a sidewalk than a garden or something.
Yeah, which makes it interesting if you're talking about is it the people or is it the environment that the people are in that's the dangerous aspect, you know? That's sort of an interesting tightrope to have to walk there.
Right. The idea, I guess I should say, the idea of the people of hip hop, which is originally was the inner city New York streets, you know, which is obviously it's become something much more diverse than that. And then, yeah, I guess I would argue too that, like, by the time Eminem started rapping, it was much more diverse than the origins of hip hop, which we could say, you know, some people will say it was a Black and Puerto Rican art. And then I would also maybe suggest that it, even at the very beginning, it incorporated a wider diversity of culture just from the sample sources and the different music elements and all the integrated influences that contained from the very beginning. But yeah, I mean,
Or even if you take it like hip hop as a culture and the four elements of it, you know, graffiti and breakdancing definitely from day one were very much a multicultural thing. You know, it wasn't just all Black kids, all Puerto Rican kids, all Spanish kids doing those two particular aspects. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I got your point related to what the era that Eminem entered into, you know, commercial rap, let's say, but hip hop as a culture, um, you know,
I just
I'm
meant that
not,
by that time, Sorry, I just meant that by that time, hip hop had spread throughout the world, and the world had inserted itself back into
Mhm,
hip hop, so it became something much wider than it
mhm,
originally may have. As it was originally, as it is commonly conceived to be from New York City
mhm,
in the beginning. It by
mhm.
that time it wasn't anymore.
It's more
Just
global.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's commercially viable too.
Yeah. I think that's what it kind of occurs to me with about M is that the I feel like the commercial machine that would be recorded rap music had been refined and was a fully fledged platform such that, and I don't actually know, like, first thing I heard from M was Slim Shady was, oh, hi, my name is, right, my name is. um I don't think that went number one in the States. I think it definitely went number one overseas though. I think it definitely went number one, like sold. I think it sold more records or stayed longer on the charts. There's some interesting statistic around just that song. A song that to this day, I mean, as far as what I had read in interviews recently, really doesn't love. He's really not super into that piece of his own history, but it was part of the machine of Eminem. And I think that's, this interesting thing about, Eminem starts looking like Superman 2, where there's an original Superman and then he gets encased in the ice and the kryptonite and everything. And then it's like they got a robot that, kind of pretends pretends to be Superman. It's like there's a story about Eminem, I think, that kind of evolves that transformation from being a backpacker, and a street kid and somebody who would be in ciphers and rep what he understood the culture to be hardcore, fully, to the point where Katzen in the D would absolutely, they claimed him. They claimed him. The Black community claimed Eminem, perhaps more than the white community, because the truth is that everybody outside of his immediate circle thought M was corny. That's why he got into it with ICP and those cats early before he ever did that kind of, his relationship with his own people in that lateral context was, I think, kind of a funny one. And I think that's, there's something about in groups and out groups where that happens. And as many times as I've been in the same room in a room full of white folks, and there's one other Black person there, and the kind of discomfort in approaching each other or trying to connect is almost about what's happening with all the people in the room versus what's really even happening between us. And I think M kind of went through that process too, but he started from somewhere that was genuine and that didn't have a commercial equivalent, so.
Yeah, this essay had me thinking a lot about what it was that really made Eminem attractive in the first place. Um, and I think he did present something new that wasn't definitely wasn't in hip hop from what I can tell before that.
Yeah, it wasn't Vanilla Ice, that's for sure, right? He had more cred. He was way more, especially if you got Dre showing up in your videos and that's the person on your records and that's who's pushing you. Now it's a different story. It starts, you know, um, yeah. Sorry did I cut you off? I didn't mean to stop you.
Nope.
Yeah, I mean, I just noticed, it's funny when you look at the dynasties, East and West Coast, because on the East Coast dynasties, because I know Weird Rap had a conversation about YBT and Chuck D, Shock Hank Lee, Flavor Unit, Queen Latifah's, um, Heavy D, all the impresarios, Shan, Original Juice Crew, all those cats. They were so, like, they created something, the persona that came from entrepreneurship of really being able to relate narratives to people that they embraced that whole concept and would construct themselves around it. You know, it's like the culture is one thing. It's one thing to get on the microphone and just rap, you know, it's like, but to really have a relationship with the code and have crews and how you fit in with everybody else became really important. You really couldn't be, you know, you could be wild if the rest of your crew was wild, you know, you could be ultra mag and every, you know, everybody's a little off anyway, you know, but you got different elements of where you came from that are represented. And on the West Coast, you know, gangster rap had this viral impact on hip hop, you know, where before, you know, it's, I always ran into white kids who were really, really into NWA and the Ghetto Boys, hands down. And speaking of that captivation, it was like, I don't think they found any of that beautiful, you know, just aesthetically, they were really interested in it. But I think in the end, that kind of persona became a shield for kids who were scared. You know, like that's, there's something about Dre's particular strain of hip hop that, you know, it's not like he was the first to weaponize it, but it sure did get pretty intense. It sure got pretty intense. And that the way that percolated among people, it was like, you couldn't tell who was really listening to NWA and believing that these cats were out shooting everybody, you know, and like, you know, however, on the other side of the fence, we would have an interesting research topic just to see how many people were murdered listening to NWA or murdered other people listening to NWA. So that danger and the theme music of street is its own capital, its own currency. And you hear this in hip hop, it's deeper than rap. You hear it in hip hop. You know, the crack era, the crack era that we speak of in hip hop in the 80s, and then the part where everybody suddenly became a crack dealer and the dealers were the people on the microphones and talking about how they were running the streets and everything. To them, that was feeding the streets. And so at the time that Eminem came along, things had gotten really intense in Death Row's camp. Suge Knight, Mob Piru, all those cats were pretty scary people. And Dre did something that I think for his platform and like kind of his, surely his pocketbook, but also his way of relating to his wider audience was like, hey, look, not everything has to be about I'm getting ready to kill you, the chronic, et cetera, et cetera. Like we got people who are skilled and talented and who can spin a narrative and tell a story and it's heat and it's hot. And in fact, I got a white kid. I'll just bring him out, you know, and unleash him on the streets. And you couldn't tell about, I was in LA when that song came out. You couldn't tell nobody in my neighborhood not to listen to the white kid. Nobody was walking around going, I don't want to listen. I don't fuck with Eminem because he's white. Everybody was so into that song. Everybody was into Eminem as a persona. You know, he was fun. He was funny. He was hip hop. He didn't give a fuck. But it was different than what had happened before. Vanilla Ice was probably the most comparable because Third Base didn't really jump off that way. ICP didn't jump off on the commercial scene that way. I'm sure there's somebody I'm probably forgetting, but
Beastie Boys.
Beasties, yeah, the Beasties were, you know, they were always kind of the quintessential hip hoppers, you know, white rap group. You know, if you're really gonna listen to some white kids, you could put on Beasties and mostly be cool, you know, but hey, that they were really popular with skating crowds when they were, you know, they kind of revamped in the 90s and stuff. And they weren't doing that thing on records where they're talking shit all the time. They were actually making a lot more sense. And they were definitely into unity. That's where they were kind of focused. M's persona and through Dr. Dre, that lens, you know, is just, you know, Aftermath, Shady Records. So that whole lens was to kind of underscore this aspect of hip hop that, you know, was funny but dangerous too. You know, it was comical and humorous, but also like it was edgy, it was real, you know. So
Yeah, I think I would relate just Eminem to the early Beastie Boys when they were talking about their guns and stuff, you know. There was that sort of dangerous character, at least, that they were presenting. And I just wanted to speak to what you were talking about, is like a white kid growing up in a real white area, and basically this being some of my first like introduction to black culture, if you can call it that at all, was through NWA. And when I was like 11 or 12, introduced to that, for me, I relate it a lot to like the way that I was attracted to horror movies and roller coasters. Like there was this shocking danger, and this like there was also just the sonic quality that I just loved for whatever reason. Like
Yeah,
even when I
sure.
heard other music that wasn't at all dangerous, that had that sonic palette, I was just attracted to that itself. But then it was the crazy lyrics that these guys were saying that made it so much like, whoa, my parents would hate this, and like this is crazy. So like I think that's a big part of the attraction also that Eminem had, because like he was saying shit that in 1998 9 or whatever, it was it was shocking. Then he was doing stuff beyond like what NWA was saying. Like he was talking about violence, and I kind of called it like shock entertainment was like a big part of what people seem to be attracted to in Eminem, is like the shock factor, as well as the humor mixed with it. And yeah, and there's probably, I think, also an element of how he didn't seem to be acting black, how he had this almost exaggerated white guy voice, especially in that "My Name Is" song, where
Hey, I got to run really quickly.
oh, okay,
Excuse me. I'll be right back. Yeah.
cool. Anyway, that was my thoughts on just like what made him attractive to people. What do you think, Chief?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Like, yeah, it's that different look at danger for sure. Because like he wasn't necessarily talking about socioeconomic or circumstantial danger. He was more talking about like vices, like drug addiction and dealing with rage, and abusive behavior and things like that, which, he wasn't the first to necessarily talk about it, but he did put a different face to it that was maybe more relatable than hearing like a Brother Lynch hung or like somebody, I'm getting hard pressed to think about like black rappers who kind of dealt with that same sort of level of depression and lashing back out against their parents and things of that nature. But
Yeah, I
it
mean, you
is
had
just
the sorry. I mean, you
no,
definitely
no,
had
no.
the I just want to say quickly, like you definitely had the danger aspect in gangster rap, and even like a little like horrorcore or whatever with Gravediggers and other similar groups, Ghetto Boys, etc. But you didn't have this element of humor, like almost sarcasm mixed in with it so much. And like what me and Nia were talking about last week was how the archetype that Eminem really seemed to be representing was like this uh, villain trickster, like the Joker, and you rarely, if ever, saw that in hip hop before. Like we were saying, maybe Esham was another example of that character.
Yeah.
Um,
You know,
Yeah, it's like
ICP. Yeah.
yeah, it's like an aloofness to actually being sincerely fascinated with evil. It's like I'm not just talking this just to get a reaction out of people. Like this is stuff that I feel, but I don't feel so like strong about it that I'm gonna sit here and give you a soapbox speech. Like I could still joke about it, and that's kind of the terrifying. It's almost like a serial killer kind of thing, Like
Yeah.
this guy's sucking all this crazy stuff and smiling the whole time.
Right. Yeah, I think that was kind of, because when we were talking about the Joker, it was interesting because the Joker's history is an interesting history. Joker was invented in the 50s as a character from the 50s. And before, I think maybe, was it Alan Moore? Before the Killing Joke, or it might have been around that time. I remember reading the Killing Joke in the 80s, and it was like, whoa, cat's shooting people, paralyzing. He's got little carnival gangsters that don't wear any clothes, and he's the Joker at that time was a live wire. He was really off the chain, and murdered Robin. There was just drama, and I felt like that was a time, looking at the history of that character, where there was more reality embedded in that difference between Batman and the Joker. But the Joker in particular as a white archetype really hails back to pervasive paranoia of white men in the 70s, dudes who murder people and leave notes and shit, and talk about body counts and travel through the countryside, finding random people and murdering them, random women murdering them. And I think that all got kind of personified in the Joker. I think that became kind of part of his personality behind a certain kind of writer. And there's so much in hip hop, especially with white males in hip hop, where that's a lane for the white male. That's a lane. ICP were crazy, and they came before M. They were actually in face paint and the whole 9 yards, dressed up like clowns, talking about how they were going to find people and have little ritual murders and the whole 9 yards. And that kind of again, it's part of it's just the area that they're from, but hey, all these dudes are actually from places that I personally right now, if you were to drop me in those neighborhoods, probably even today, I wouldn't necessarily be safe. So being crazy has always been kind of the story about the white cats who hang out with black folks. It's like, what did you do? Right? There's that joke. What did you do to hang out with the brothers like that? What kind of crimes do you commit on the side, or what kind of shit are you into to the point where, you can just hang out with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and be fully comfortable? Like what kind of situation is that? What kind of situation, Vanilla Ice is more like James Dean, rebel. And there's some of that echo, in the cultural aesthetic of the white rapper. But I think M really kind of tapped into that serial killer vibe. And he wasn't the only one. R.A. the Rugged Man was also kind of white dude who'd get on the record and just crazy. Necro, I don't know. I'm trying to just triangulate that area of his releases, but
maybe too, the acceptable element of that fantastic violence that all those groups you talk about is the target, because each one of those groups kind of has their own target that people on a universal scale, or maybe I shouldn't say universal, but at least on an American scale, can probably understand, because Eminem's target was largely his parents. Everybody rebels against their parents. ICP's main target was rednecks, which most people are trying to support rednecks. Right. R.A. the Rugged Man's target was other rappers. So it's like, but it's like none of these guys was out there like, I'm killing everybody indiscriminately. Right. When Eminem would do it, it would clearly be a joke. He would set it up as a premise to a joke, or it's like commentary with like all the Columbine stuff that he got into eventually. But they'd be dark jokes. But
I think.
But it's not like I'm out here killing gangsters. I'm not out here killing.
I don't know. Moving in on people's blocks and it reminds me, his relationship with Everlast always was interesting to me. And I think sometimes when people talk about House of Pain, they kind of forget how tight the Soul Assassins community was, especially in the West Coast. So, Cypress, first of all, being like seminal West Coast hip hop with a East Coast flavor. They were welcomed on both sides of the map. Everlast being one of those people who was really down with them from day one. I think they were down for really, really early, but still you know, and to that degree was always an authentic person, you know, for the most part. And I'm not claiming to know Everlast personally or anything, but I do think that the persona itself really kind of matched with a certain groundedness that Everlast, and probably even till this day, is still, you know, the type of dude who gets on the microphone, he speaks to the common man. And, you know, common white man, maybe common man, I don't know, you know, but the class relationship is interesting because Everlast comes off as very working class. You know, he looked like a dude who had a few jobs. Eminem is the kind of person you can't hire, you know, and it's like the interplay between those two, they ended up beefing at one point, and I always thought it was really interesting. It's just like, how is it possible for them to really have a problem with each other? You know, what was that really about? And also, like, ICP and him beefed and had diss songs between each other, and it's like, well, I think you know, some of what I've just learned about that beef over the years is like, right, I think M was being M, and kind of strolled up to them with their name on a flyer and was like, yo, we're throwing a party, you want to come? You know, I'm throwing a party with you, do you want to come to it, you know? And they were like, hey, we're the buzz right now, we got it on lockdown, why you got our name on a flyer, we don't know you, you're a scrub, what is this, you know? And that those personalities outside of off the record, off wax, clashed, and they spent a lot of time talking poorly about each other. Cage is another one of those rappers that got into it with every other white rapper. I mean, like Copyright, Ohio Copyright, a lot of those Eastern Conference cats, another like white, you know, community of white folks, just beefing with each other. But you really never hear those people talk about how they're getting ready to, you know, take over, you know, parts of where they're from, that were primarily Black communities. And it's interesting when you look at the relationship to Black community across, you know, across the ethnic boundary. Like, white folks need to have a certain relationship with the Black community to be authentic in rap music and hip hop music. MGK, like, people really, you know, are into MGK in Cleveland. Black folks are into MGK in Cleveland. That's who he claims, that's his community. Not, you know, white kids might love him too, but at the end of the day, when he needs to go home and have a show or to really kind of get reconnected with his audience, it's mostly Black folks that show up. You know, I truly believe that. I don't know if that'll always be true, or if even if that's still true today. But you know, sometimes when you see these personality clashes, it's almost like white MCs and these personas are fighting over their favor in the Black community. You know, in rap music, they're often struggling over who's more authentic, who's, you know, and that's the nature of hip hop culture. But there's this real interesting kind of circumference around, you can be as crazy as you want to on a record. You can say anything you want on a record. And in fact, a lot of people, I think hip hop, I don't know of any other art form today where you can die based off of what you say in a verse. You can write yourself right out of this world based on what you put in a verse. I don't know any other, you know, from Pop Smoke to anybody, I don't know any other form of music or art form even where the antagonism can come back to you and take your life. You could be taken away from the hip hop community, you'd be taken away from the Black community, you know, and you could be taken away from the urban community, you know. And so that's kind of the flip side to hip hop. It's deeper than rap, because rap music gets real. Rap and hip hop get very, very real. That battling culture was meant to diffuse what would otherwise have been violent confrontation. It was, you know, it's about getting into a word for word, bar for bar, verse for verse with another MC, in another neighborhood, you know, especially when MC battles, there was a time when you had to walk around people's neighborhood. You had to be official. You had to be the kind of person who was official enough that you could walk into a place where you're not super tight with anybody, or, you know, you're showing up on the strength of your talent. Like, hey, you gotta fuck with this person because they're so vicious with how they use the language, you know. And there's a relationship that I think urban Black culture, whoever that, you know, whoever's in that culture, they always have with, you know, the conflict. It's aesthetically pleasing to have conflict. It means that we're talking about sharpening skills. It means that if I'm on 2 turntables and you're across the row on 2 turntables, we can go head to head. And you can tell who's talented. It doesn't matter where they're from or whatever. You can tell who's talented. But at the end of the day, especially in battle rap and MCs back in the day, you could be in the wrong neighborhood and win a battle. You could say enough in a battle to where even if you won it, you need to make sure you get right out of there because you may not survive winning, you know. And M always kind of preoccupied me from a place of like, hey, you know, you're not like, you're risky on wax. You're risky, you know, you like to talk shit, you know, but as a person, like in terms of, you know, what your relationship is with the streets, surely Eminem had to survive encounters with people that did not like the fact that he was a talented white dude. They didn't like being, you know, that the fact that he was even talented, you know. And I know a lot of MCs, a lot of cats who are still battling today talk about their encounters with Eminem, you know. And you know, when you're the MC, you respect it. You're like, okay, well, you got me. It's like you got the language, you got the verses. You got to respect it. But the people around you and the community you rep are the people that's a different relationship. So it's like there's a care that comes with, you know, someone like M engaging in real hip hop culture that does not exist once you get to, you know, major Interscope release, Eminem, Slim Shady record, you know. Then he can talk about anybody he wants to. And he talked about everybody, Britney Spears, and he talked about Vanilla Ice, I don't know, Justin Timberlake, all of the celebrity, all the white celebrity, all the white idols, all the white suburban idols. Because that was kind of Eminem's angle, was like, I'm the urban white cat who don't have a problem, you know, getting on wax and talking about chopping up my baby's mom. And also in the same sentence, I'm gonna laugh about it and then, you know, diss Paris Hilton. That's me. I'm Eminem, you know. And it's like, there's so much about that would almost be unacceptable in the Black community. If M was Black and talked about raping his own mother, there are not a lot of Black folks that you walked in the studio with that would really fuck with you after. I don't think so. You know, I mean, I could say I really don't. That's not a place that the Black MC can occupy unscathed, with their persona unscathed. That's not really something you even say on a record, you know, from the Black cultural aesthetic. You know?
Funny enough, it kind of comes back to the religion thing with that too. You know, the deep rooted religion culture. You just kind of don't do things of that nature that are that inherently evil. You know,
right. Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. You know, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but
yeah, no, I think that's real. You know, it's like white. I mean, Black Americans come from Baptist traditions. You know, it's just that's, you know, not all of us come from Islam. You know, it's like, but those cultural foundations in the Black community, whether you know it or not, most Black folks are still kind of trained on that stuff. I mean, you know, trained. I use that's not the right word I want to use. I just think we're familiar with what we consider to be pro-social. You can be antisocial on a record. You can say, I got a problem with people across the way. You can talk about what you're going to do to them. That's conflict. To be pro-social in the Black community is for the most part like the mother, you know, unless they're really kind of getting into their background and what their relationship is with their mom, you know, Tupac style, my mom, you know, talking about their, you know, the mother figure. But but I don't know. And I would maybe Lurch is one of those people who had, who's got, rape fascination and all that on his records. But it's not. I can't say I would know for sure. But that was the white community's problem with M. And sure enough, it was also the Black community's problem with Eminem in the end too. But yeah, when it came to that sort of the, not a flirtation with violence, but a real in-depth inside view of this white dude who wants to put his girlfriend in the trunk of his car, and wants to, murder his mother or rape her or whatever. And I think if that were Dr. Dre saying all that, people would never fuck with Dre ever again. Snoop Dogg would have never said that. If we're just looking at the kind of commercial equivalents or whatever, Everlast could have never said that and still had the same folks who were really into Soul Assassins, Cypress and stuff, and House of Pain really still relate to him. That's a departure from, what he's established as who he is on record. Whereas M started out the gate that way. And now it's funny because, yeah, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just, seems like Jonah's got a lot going on in his mind. I'd be curious to kind of hear it.
No, I was just, a lot of what you're saying totally rings true. I was thinking about, that is really interesting. That I'd never thought about that before. The mother connection in Black culture compared to white culture. There is a big difference there. I just never thought about that before. For whatever the reason may be, I mean, it would maybe take a lot more psychology and research to really pinpoint that. But that was one of those really enticing things about Eminem, is you hadn't heard that done really before. Just such like this like tabloid-esque, like, I was comparing it to like the attraction that people have to the Jerry Springer show, where these people airing out their dirty laundry about their family in public. Like, this hadn't been done. It's kind of taboo, and it's so entertaining, so engrossing for people. And I I don't know if white culture like absorbed that differently than Black culture did at the time, when this was such a new phenomenon. But I think, I mean, I was never a real big fan of Eminem, so I can't say for myself. But like, my estimation was that like a lot of white kids were like, ooh, like, this is juicy, intriguing, like soap opera kind of material, like the drama. It was entertainment, pure entertainment and intrigue. Um, and then, but the part for me that I always really respected the most, that kind of resonated most with me, was the battling other pop culture figures, the icons of like cheesy pop entertainment that were celebrated. And that's what I loved. That's what like really resonated with me, seeing him just take down, the other shitty pop stars. But and that was also something that you hadn't really seen. I mean, I related that to like stand-up comedy. Like, you see a lot of like stand-up comedians doing that. And to get racial again, maybe that is a more of a white stand-up or a white thing, to like make fun of pop culture in general like that. Whereas your Richard Pryors and your Eddie Murphys, um were like they had different targets than just your general society, kind of. I don't know.
Or it was, or they kind of, if they talked about white culture in a negative way, it was more of a mockery and less of a takedown. It was more like observational. Isn't it funny how our culture's like this and their culture's like this, as opposed to like, there's this list of problematic people and we need to, or not even problematic, because Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, they're not problematic. They just happen to occupy the same space. that Eminem is in, but Eminem is coming into that space with a completely different set of weaponry than them and a completely different intention. So
Yeah, I
maybe
guess if yeah, to me it makes
go ahead.
sense if you take into a, if you buy the idea that white people are privileged, the white male is at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, then what are your options for, you know, if you're going to punch something, what else can it be but the made up like heavens of the celebrity world, like, whereas you're, you know, a culturally oppressed like horror person, you got lots of like real like enemies to punch up at, you know, that are, you know, the white guy, the white cop on your block, you know. So it would, yeah.
Yeah, I think you know, it's in yeah, I mean, I think there's something interesting about how, you know, black culture is in some ways, especially because we're talking about an academic paper, and there's a lot here. I'm just kind of skimming over it and noticing some things that are called out, but the black culture has often been posed as a living critique of white Western culture. Um, and to the degree that there are many art forms that come out of the Black urban environment, that come out of the diverse environment of, you know, the cross-cultural environment, Latino, Asian, um, Hispanic, is, you know, it's like there is something intrinsic to hip hop that naturally orients itself towards the critique of the public in a way that is harder to do um, when you're you know, when you're sort of a political, when you're sort of trying to be politically mindful. Hip hop is political and yet doesn't have to play by the rules. Um, and I think M kind of took that politic, you know, because really what he's doing with that is politicking. I don't see it any other way, you know. I mean, I don't really think M legitimately had a beef with Christina Aguilera or Britney Spears or Paris Hilton, whoever. You know, Christopher Reeves, everybody was mad at him when he came out with that joint about Christopher Reeves dying. And hey, I love Christopher. You know, it's like there's that's part of the charm of hip hop, and I mean charm in the same way as it's illusory, that you know, M could kind of get more cultural capital by taking down those idols, you know, and kind of feeding himself off the controversy that came as a result, you know. It's one of those things that you know, it defined its own way of being that kind of criticism, especially coming from a white MC. Um, but I think that hip hop always had people who were willing to poke fun or lampoon or talk about how they get ready to murder so and so. Remember Ice Cube threatened Al Davis and, you know, everybody, the entire Raiders camp at one point, you know, was talking about how they didn't pay him right, and that, you know, they were going to murder him, you know. Just to, you know, there's the thing about punching down really resonates, you know. It's like that really resonates. I don't know, until I'm not sure what M got political about. Like Stan, I feel like Stan was something of like a M reimagining himself. You know, I think Stan is Eminem. That's really who M was. Um, and but otherwise, you notice that he doesn't necessarily kind of stump for anybody. M is all about deconstruction, dismantling. M didn't really get into building until later, and that's, you know, something I think that is a natural part of hip hop culture and the community. You can be a deconstructionist, you know, you can be a breaker, or you could be someone that builds and begins to assemble things. And it's not necessarily a clean divide. It's not easy to always tell one from the other, you know, but this relationship that the MC has with building narratives and building representations of communities that most people wouldn't have never really thought about. You know, I think a lot about Ghostface. You know, Ghost talks about his neighborhood over old 70s soul samples, 60s, 70s soul samples with love and affection, while he's also relating stories about those places that hurt. You know, I don't know if M really got into that until he was really talking about himself. And there is an aspect to, you know, like, again, taking the Beasties and Eminem and comparing them, like the Beasties became humanitarians. They became people who were ready to rap. They wanted to bust, you know, they wanted to get down, but they were also kind of talking about the safety of their concert goers, the safety of women in their circles, especially after what, you know, especially after what they committed to human history in the 80s. You know, it was like they did a 180 entirely. They decided that really wasn't them. You know, and granted, a lot of that was Rick Rubin's influence, you know, I mean, and a lot of that was just being young. So when did M grow up to the point where he could really speak about other people with more of a, with more content than just, you know, I'm gonna cut so-and-so's head off and, you know, like little cute verses about, you know, the white girl in the videos, you know.
Well,
Um,
the smart thing that Eminem did to kind of preemptively handle that was to split himself into three personas. To have Slim Shady
mm,
to do all
mm,
the fantastic elements,
mm,
Eminem to do all the cultural aspect elements, and then Marshall Mathers
Marshall.
to be the voice piece. You know, the this is
Right.
me as a real person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which wasn't even necessarily abundantly clear from day one, unless you were just really like analyzing what he was saying. But by the time he dropped the Marshall Mathers LP,
Yeah.
it was kind of starting to make more sense in that context.
Yeah. Facts. I do. You know, I don't know when last time y'all listened to Infinite. You listen to Infinite? I haven't listened to it in a long, long time, but
It's
you
been a
know,
very long time.
yeah, that's basically a Christian album. You know, that's like a very positive album considering where, you know, where M started is super fascinating because his initial recordings weren't really like Slim Shady, Marshall Mathers, et cetera, et cetera. You know, he was more of a, you know, MC. It looks like, do you have it, Chief? Is that it? Do you have it?
I couldn't remember if the single I had was from Infinite, but it was like
Mm,
the right in between Infinite and Slim Shady. It's a
okay.
just that get fucked, but it's got brain damage on it.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it was like he was already on Interscope Aftermath by that point.
Mhm, mhm.
I never even listened to Infinite in full. I listened to a couple tracks, I think, but I don't remember it. But
One thing, so I know we've been hanging on this, talking about Eminem, kind of, but when we were sort of talking about him and his takedown and his like punching at people within his realm, it got me to thinking about Chino XL because Chino XL is somebody who did a very similar thing, but it didn't necessarily work for him the same way that it worked for Eminem, even though
Right.
96, 98, they were pretty close to one another.
Mhm.
So I don't, does that kind of make race the main factor in that success?
Um,
I think it
Chino's
was a
an
big
interest.
factor.
Uh, yeah, sorry. Can you repeat that point? Because I think I kind of missed it. I was
I was, I
distracted.
guess I was just curious. It wasn't even a point. I'm just kind of, because I hadn't thought about this till just now, but I was just kind of curious if the fact that both of them were coming with a very similar approach.
Mm,
And I
mhm,
would say that Chino XL is a pretty skilled MC. You know, maybe people wouldn't put him on the same level as Eminem, but I think
mhm,
Chino's better than an average cat. So I just
mhm.
kind of want, and both of them sort of have an ear for mediocre production. So it makes me wonder, like, Is race the factor that makes Eminem work and Chino Excel not work?
I just realized with you saying that, both those cats would have had a diss record out tomorrow. I heard what you had to say about their beat selection.
Yeah, they would
Because
kill
they're
my
both
career.
quick to, yeah, Chino's really quick to, I think it's like, you know, yeah. I find, you know, some of Chino always kind of, I hate to put it out in public, but there's a certain desperation that I feel like Chino encapsulated. I'm not sure why I got that sense from him. And, you know, I haven't really revisited Chino in a long time, but he always seemed like someone who was searching for an identity, and not that he didn't represent himself or know who he was on a record, but it was like there was a part of me that was like, okay, it's hard for me to really take this seriously, because I think of just how steeped in the urban he was. Because it's like, man, if you wanted to, you know, you want to be a serial killer on the record, you know, you could just go join any gang or any crew in your neighborhood and be shooting people tomorrow, and that's what you'd be talking about. Instead, here you are, you talking. It's very, very complicated how you're going about, you know, this persona and building a persona on record. Whereas, you know, Bushwick Bill was always the kind of person where I thought I would just think, God, I would hate to meet this person actually in real life. Like, this person sounds demented and scary and on something. You know, the photos of him with his eye hanging out. He's on the, you know, it's just like, to me, that's the sort of, you know, that there's a flirtation that some MCs have with reality. It's like, how much of reality do you want to get into, um, to then exist on record? What aspect of your art and what aspect of what you have to say really feeds into, you know, a sense of the real, to the listener? And I always felt like M was never real so much, you know. And Chino, I always felt like was very, like, he was really, there was something about what he was saying where he wanted that to be his reality, or he was really kind of consumed with that reality. But I would claim ignorance around Chino, and I would have to sit back and really listen to more of his stuff to, you know, and, you know, yeah, to really, you know, take it in again, you know. And
I agree that you're with the point that the like rugged street kind of character around Chino clashed with Eminem in the way that he had an almost angelic image. Like, he looked like just like exactly the type of guy that your white cheerleader wants to bring home to meet their parents. You know, like, his image, I think, was one of the factors, but I think it was a package to like speak to what you're saying, Chief, about the racial element of Eminem. I think that was part of the package, the fact that he was white, but also the fact that he didn't look like your RA the Rugged Man. He looked like your little Poindexter from next door. Like, I think, like, between the Infinite album and the debut, what was it called? His first album?
Slim Shady LP.
Yeah, he became like the bleach blonde little, like, almost like Ken doll looking figure. um and I think that was part of it, as well as like the humor, the satire, the violence. It all worked together as this kind of a package, I think, of different elements. And again, like the intrigue of the family drama. It all worked together to appeal to different people in different ways, I think. And then it wasn't to for me after like the second album came out. Then I really had to respect him as just as an MC. Like, he was pretty talented. Like, by that album, I could not deny it. Like, I didn't want to admit it from the first, like I heard the first single, I was like, this is not he's not very talented, you know. But then I couldn't deny the talent after a while, and I think that was another element that really hooked people. But as far as the attraction to Eminem, I don't know. That's how I see it.
Can I ask a question real quick that we can edit out? This is more of a production question. How would y'all feel about this being a? It seems we're going kind of long talking about Eminem. How would y'all feel about making this a two-parter and talking about Eminem and then talking about Rux and the way he sort of
Yeah,
positions his art?
I was hoping to kind of try to get back to it a little bit. Yeah, are you feeling like you got to go soon, Chief?
It wasn't even necessarily that. I mean, I'm down to run as long as y'all are down to run too. But
Oh, you mean just
it's,
like to present it
it's
to the
much,
public as two different things?
yeah. I mean, I guess we don't necessarily have to shoot it at a different time either. It just seems like as much as we've been talking about Eminem, we're still only scratching
Yeah.
the surface. You
Yeah.
know, and I've got plenty to say about this Rux article in his very limited view, but I'll save that for when we get into it.
Well, I think that
Yeah,
this
let's
might be
try to
a segue. Might be a good segue. What?
let's try to get to the book, yeah. And
Yeah.
I mean the essay. And yeah, maybe we will want to do another like a two-parter or something, but if
Well,
anyone's
then,
tired, if anyone, is starting to get fatigued, just say so. Like I don't mind continuing this at another date. Um
no, I didn't mean to say it like that because yeah, no, I'm down to talk about it. But yeah, so I guess if we want to continue, then unless y'all had anything else to kind of bring up about Eminem specific to what we've been talking about,
well, here's a
I'm kind of
question. Here's a question I
go.
have for both of you that relates to the kind of what I saw as the thesis of the essay, which is there some validity to the idea of a culture? We can even take race out of the equation, maybe for the sake of argument, just the idea of a culture that and the idea of it being somehow infiltrated or harmed from an outsider coming into it in the wrong way. Because I feel like that's a lot of what the essay in this book that it comes from are really getting at, the idea of white people infecting a black culture, or even just the idea of the sanctity of a culture um, getting messed up by outsiders coming into it with the wrong intentions or just ignorance.
To me, that kind of is a two-level approach because I feel if we're talking about it specifically in terms of culture and impact on the culture, I would hope that hip hop has built a strong enough foundation to where just within itself, outsiders couldn't come in and impact the culture from within to the point to where they could systematically shift it or break it down into something that it wasn't originally intended. But then when you throw the economic aspect into it and the monetization aspect into it, it opens up the judgment to a much wider audience who may not necessarily be as informed about the culture as those who directly partake and those who are direct fans of it. So if the proportional voice starts to shift towards more of those that are looking at it from the monetary aspect and the statistical aspect, because that's really the only way to sort of, analytically break that down if you're going to talk about it in numbers, that could be damaging in the sense that it could limit opportunity for diversity. I think I may not, necessarily even be answering what you're asking directly, but
I think you are answering it, and I think I agree with what you're saying.
Um, I think that I think it's possible to get culture wrong. And I think that I'm glad that, Chief, you mentioned the monetary and the commoditization of the art form, because capital tends to often ruin good things. You know, capitalizing and capitalization. And sometimes with capital, we're not just talking about money. Sometimes, this is an interesting subject when, you get into activism, because, if you have problems with capitalist systems, you have problems with commoditization and, the removal of authenticity and the removal of the real essence can be very obvious. However, something that happens with capital is that people who have it can exchange it for any number of things. And I think in hip hop culture, the capital is up for grabs. And I think that as a youth-oriented culture, hip hop has an amnesia where people kind of forget what happened even a decade ago. And kids will forget what happened. You kind of have to, real like hip hop heads, dyed-in-the-wool hip hop heads, they discover what came before them, and that informs their relationship with the art form. Today, you see any number of people, whatever ethnicity, having co-opted trap and drill, and essentially kind of becoming rap stars overnight. And I think it's very similar to punk in a way, where the basis and the foundation for why that's even a word that we use for people, or why that's even a kind of social relationship that you have with your outside world, I definitely think that gets lost and watered down through the progression of the commoditization. And yet you will always have people in hip hop culture, and that, again, that foundation is always going to be important, because you'll always have people who are happy to battle out in the street, or to dance and create new forms of movement, or that white people, or did we remove that, or just anybody? Because I think the truth is you can get culture wrong. You can get culture wrong right now. If you go any group of people that you have affinity with, that you share relationships with, that you have, in pro-social behavior, they call it the socio-cognitive affinity and sympathy with, empathy, and you get the wrong message and begin to kind of perpetuate that wrong messaging, you can be wrong in that culture too. The difference is that the size and the sort of the blast radius of culture being what it is, you can get it wrong in a little zone. You can show up at a party and say the wrong thing and have people looking at you crazy, or have to have conversations that aren't comfortable. You can be the kind of person who chooses to, represent yourself in the garb of a style or whatever, and not to pick on any genres in particular, but like, we never wanted hip hop to turn into goth music or goth aesthetics, right? Because that's something where you can go to Hot Topic and, and it's like the same thing exists in hip hop culture, but there are enough signifiers where who you're talking to. You only need to talk about a couple albums, even one album, and you already know what the person who you share this culture with, you already know what their degree of familiarity with it is. It only takes very limited exchanges. Hip hop has this compression and this protocol around how you relate to each other that gets right to the heart of how connected to the culture you really are, and I have, I used to go to the Milk Bar in San Francisco, used to go to just all the spots to see people, and would run into people just randomly at the show and talk and stuff. And like everybody, so many cool folks. Sometimes it wasn't great. Go to shows in LA, grew up there. And, you'd find all kinds of problematic people roaming around. And there is a point where, regardless of what ethnicity they are, you can kind of tell. You say that person's crazy. It doesn't matter if they're into hip hop or not. And if they are, I don't care. I don't care what they're into, but they've really lost their mind. And it's just the chaos of that environment sometimes can just get the violence, all that, you know, where you stop being able to be a woman and be able to go to a show and enjoy yourself, you know, because of how rap and hip hop conjoined into a commercial artifact that led men to believe that they could act a certain way with impunity. You know, and when we talk about hip hop culture, it's kind of like there's always that area, but we never, you know, I think hip hop was never supposed to be easily accessible to everybody. It was the 90s where, you know, late 90s, suddenly you hear it on the record. Oh, everybody wants to be an MC now. Okay. Everybody raps now. All right. You know, it's you can mimic, you can say the right words, you can pretend and act and everything, but people know the difference. There's no way to miss it. You can't miss the difference in real authentic, you know, being in hip hop versus dressing up in the skin of a hip hop fan, you know, and draping yourself in the artifacts of a hip hop fan. And I don't mean that you got to sit and have an encyclopedic knowledge of what came before you. What I mean is that when you're really into hip hop, then it's real, you know, that the realness doesn't escape you. And hip hop's realness isn't, you know, it isn't optional. You know, you can decide who you listen to, but you're going to get something real, whether you like it or not. You know, it's not purely the world of fantasy or, you know, or within the mind that you can create a non-material entity that then exists on the record. And there is like, you know, that there's not a, an analog to it in real, you know, real corporeal hip hop. And, you know, interesting because, and I don't know if we want to drag it back to Eminem or not, but I kind of forgot that Marilyn Manson came out around this time. Marilyn Manson had released records before they got big, you know, before he got big with Antichrist. And again, real interesting relationship that we'll always have with authenticity. And I think especially in American culture, we'll always struggle with authenticity because I think it's hard for people to tell you where shit came from anyway. I think it's actually difficult for people to relate to the source and represent it authentically without being questioned themselves. And so we kind of live in this real interesting kind of fragmented mirror world, like, oh, are you really the gangster? Are you really that dude? No, you're not. You listen to the record of the guy, and then you get to the guy who made the record, and it's like, are you, yo, aren't you Ice Cube? Don't you murder 800 people on wax? Aren't you that dude? You're super gangster. You know, turns out Ice Cube's relationship with his neighborhood and who he came up with and stuff is contentious, you know, and he's from neighborhoods for real, but what he talks on record is it doesn't necessarily align with the people who came up with him, who grew up with him and know him. And so now suddenly you have, oh, well, where's the realness? Is that the real, but that's not the real person? Who's not realer than Ice Cube? Who's not realer than, you know, any of these cats, any of these dudes on records who, you know, who's not real and who is real? And this becomes the central axiom in hip hop music. And there's all kinds of filters and codes and ways of trying to sort out what's really real. You know, is it real? Keep it real. Are you get, you know, reality and realness become their own language. And, you know, there was a moment in the 90s where it was like, hey, I'm real. I'm all about it. Cats come out swagging, you know, being on record. I'm the real one. And you find out later, like, okay, somebody gassed you up and you got a record deal that was bunk. They gave you $15,000 and then you got on a microphone and talked about how you run all of the Bronx. And that's not true. That's definitely not you, you know? So I think there's like, it's always like, hip hop always feels like this pinhole universe that you can see the larger multiverse outside of, but within its own pocket has its own rules and relationships and its own universe that stays intact. And people kind of coming into that don't always realize, like, especially in hip hop culture, you know, the critique of American culture coming out of hip hop is as old as the art form itself. Okay. It's always going to be there. It's never not going to be there. How adroit and articulate and the potency to which people can kind of engage in that, you know, the potency and their connection with where they actually come from, because that's really hip hop, is to be the kind of person who's like, yeah, I'm from a random block in some suburb, and that's okay. I don't have to apologize for that. That doesn't mean I don't have anything to say on a microphone. I think that's really important to see. When we get into commercialization, now we have to capitalize off of who's real and who isn't. So you being from the suburb isn't something I can sell. I need you to be from Miami. I need you to be, you know, down with the Cubans. I need you to be connected to drug routes and the whole 9 yards. There's some cats who, you know, are billion-dollar MCs, sell all these records, and they're still talking about stuff they did from the ages of, you know, 13 to 19 and haven't sold a drug since. And they put that out, and people in the streets who are really murdering people and really selling drugs can feel it. And then they continue to perpetuate their behavior on that. So, you know, again, that build and destructive relationship and that realness, what's real, you know, in hip hop is the eternal question. And when people stop relating to it that way, and I notice, and I'm just, you know, only because we're talking about this, it's like, you know, we had, you know, Weird Rap was, you know, there was this like real hip hop head, you know, account and like the purest hip hop head account, you know, and it's like, when we lose our relationship with, at hip hop's core, just the question, not the answer, but the question, what is real? Then we're shortchanging ourselves on the experience. You know, when we jump to conclusions and we're like, yo, that's not real, that's not it, you know, you need other people to do that. But in the end, when you start actually getting to meet people who you listen to, or you become more familiar with your surroundings within a hip hop setting, community, whatever, you start to realize it's not really your place to tell other people whether they're real or not. When somebody comes out and says, I'm real, you got to leave it up to them, you know, and perhaps not even get too attached to it, you know, so.
So I definitely agree that this focus on authenticity and realness has been central to hip hop, especially at the time of the writing of this essay. But I wonder if since then, since the around the time of the rise of Eminem, if things have strayed further away from that, where could even be that Eminem created extra space in the hip hop superstar realm for a lack of realness. And I'm talking about artists that came up in his wake, like Kanye West to Drake to to the point now where it's fully it's fine that Drake has ghostwriters. You know, people are cool with that, you know, and it's like real people don't say keep it real anymore in their rap lyrics. And there's definitely still a strain of that, a strong strain within hip hop, but I think there in recent years there's become a strain of it's okay to not be real. And I think you can even possibly mirror our whole society is mirroring that in a way with this, like the whole conspiracy world and the deep fake age where no one knows what's really real, you can't trust anything. Maybe that's maybe that's a stretch to compare those two things, but I just thought it's interesting to note, like I feel like the realness of hip hop has started to maybe dwindle. What do you think?
Well, also, I guess if you're kind of talking about that post Eminem generation being the generation that doesn't necessarily hold realness in the same value, if I'm getting my generational timelines correct, these are probably people who were kids when Biggie and Tupac were shot. So you kind of see this very, very real result
Yeah,
of how, as Dave Chappelle would say, how keeping it real goes wrong,
yeah.
which is
Odd
kind of
odd
evolved.
future too. I think they're an important piece in this puzzle.
Well, yeah, yeah. Odd Future is 100%. You know, because I think Odd Future opens the door for your current day cats that are like, your little Uzis and your little Yachties and your folks who are like, well, it's a vibe, it's not, even if you do have your 21 Savage or Playboy Cardi types that are still talking like violent stuff, they're still doing it more from this context of we're making vibe based music more so than we're making this authentic hardcore gangster music that you need to take heed to what I'm saying because you might end up being on the receiving end of what I'm saying.
Mm.
And maybe it is sort of an escapist thing more so now that a surreal approach like Eminem can open the door to that as it turns back around in on itself in the culture.
Mm. Yeah, I think the whole, the whole, that personas became so important in the music. I think it is just interesting, and the landmark of the Tupac and Biggie murders is really important because having to constantly return to who's real means that ultimately you're weaponizing your perspective, you're weaponizing your impression, and so if if nobody's real and you're the only real, real person, real bitch, real dude, real whoever, like if you're that realist, then that kind of means that you're an alpha, and there are not a lot of people who can really stand around you or be connected to you. And again, with that hierarchical, there's something, about hip hop where establishing the dominance is the first move in the game. You don't even put out a single in the hip hop game, the rap game, unless you're really going hard and you're really getting ready to, stake your claim and present yourself and rep it, But outside of that alpha mentality, you had something that was more like conscious, conscious hip hop, which always escaped the popular audience, because if you were saying too much and you had too much content, too much substance, or if and by the way, you were being careful with your words and considerate about what you were the stories you were relating and from what point of view you're speaking from, that was too much for people to parse. And not to mention, well, what are you supposed to do with it except listen to some dude tell you, he's got it all figured out, or you just hope it's funky. You hope it's got more to it than just, I read a few books, now I'm getting ready to rhyme about it, and it's like persona kind of often is the glue between the realist, the alpha mentality, and the conscious mentality. And as far as youth-driven culture and generations go, hip hop came from kids who grew up, and I would surely include myself, where you saw the pecking order. You're either a worker or a boss. You're either making moves or faking moves. You're either really in the lane and you're making real dough and you're hustling and it's real, because that's what's real money, is that you be out in the street and have, a $500 roll, or drop 50K on a vehicle, or be in the neighborhood and just, they used to call lamp it, it's just that you're really comfortable with your success. You're comfortable with your success and nobody can really touch it. They can't get close enough to you, right? And like, it's like there, and then there's the people who see that success and want to rob you. So you're constantly in this war of attrition. And, once, because of the real aspect to it, it's not like we're just talking about a bunch of like really tough people sitting around deciding when they're going to shoot each other and having beefs that go on for years and years. No. It gets deeper. It means somebody caught you selling dope at your mom's house. You got thrown in jail. You haven't seen the light of day in 25 years. the kids who knew you when you were really hot still think about you, whether they heard of you or not. And there's already a little version of you in your neighborhood claiming your name. And so what's interesting about the new generation is, Lil Wayne is kind of missing out of this picture too, like where you have this kind of like dyed in the wool bred hip hop alpha, in a sense, a kid who, was probably running the streets just as much, but had money early. Lil Wayne had more money than most kids did, and yet was still identifying as an urban, outsider, still identifying not an urban insider, but but really a villain, and today, like Lil Wayne, and I think it's just, I grew up in LA, the culture, gang culture, putting little in front of your name means you got to big somebody. That means that your dad is behind the walls, and that's, you represent him, and that's what you're calling yourself to keep his name in the street. Okay, and so the way the game flipped between the era where, 80s crack era, those kids grew up and said, hey, I'm here to hustle. I'm not here to do any drugs. I'm not here to get high. Get the fuck out of here. I'm here to hustle. I make money. I don't sit around and smoke anything. My name, not on a pipe. None of that. That's all whack anyway. I don't snort drugs. I don't, Dre, even I don't smoke weed or cess. Guess what? And it's like, that's where they were coming from. That's where the generation was coming from. At 42, that's where my generation was definitely coming from. You weren't trying to be out in the street high. You trying to be out in the street to flip, something on people who couldn't stay away from you because they needed what you had. And that was what you wanted to be. The realest person in that scope was, was successful in doing that. And even even there was a point where being real meant not only doing it, but getting caught for it and going to jail. So the blueprint is actually kind of fucked up. And, M would have been just a bit, Big and Tupac kind of checked out around the time when ecstasy really got big in hip hop circles. I feel like rave culture was always had MDMA. Once MDMA started really hitting hip hop circles, Fizz, the whole 9 yards, that whole era, that changed the mentality. That meant that being an alpha wasn't as important. At least being an alpha in the streets wasn't important, and not to mention the post-traumatic stress disorder of the hip hop fan took so much. There's so much about, Tyler and Odd Future, ASAP, there was definitely some throwbacks that came out of their particular era. There was still boom bap. It was still relevant, but that was also more kind of vibey and less about what I have to say right now. I don't need to tell you I'm amazing. I just got to really kick it on this record and make you feel how my life is. It had to, there was a necessary transformation, I think, to vibe, because everything in words and linguistics, frankly, is kind of a Western civ construct anyway, that things have to be put into words in order for everybody to understand it. That's a kind of that's a concept that we're still, in certain, the older generation, we're still married to the language. We're still married to what you're saying and the power of the word. It is what it is. This is the word. Whereas I think in this new generation, the word, because we're in, especially in the information age, words don't really mean a whole lot anymore, and the sort of the Cohen of, you don't listen to what people say, you watch what they do, I think is really more intrinsic to this generation. And what they're doing is definitely, I definitely feel that escapism. I think that's real. I think that there's surely an escapism. There's an escapism into all kinds of things. There's escapism into hyperbolic gangsta-isms. Like, you're so gay, you can't even, Drake is actually a real one because, you know, he's the kind of dude who looks like, you know, he's like Albie Shore or something. Like Drake took the lane of people who were smooth and in the Black community, light skinned, and you know, he was able to maneuver that soft image into being able to be hard on one record and getting all the love from all these cats because he's feeding them. He's able to pay game. He's able to pay these cats to get on record with him, and they make a lot of money when they release records together. So it's a two-way street. But the commoditization, if it didn't make money, they wouldn't bother. You know, I believe this. You know, I think a lot of the little era mumble rappers, if they couldn't just if it didn't blow after a couple tracks that they released, then they probably gave up or got murdered over something, you know. But yeah, the microcosm of realness and how that translates generationally is always going to be conflicted, especially in American culture, because we tend to package things as decades anyway. We're not even that old anyway. Other people, you know, other cultures, they got language. They tell how old you are based on how you speak French or Italian. You know, they got families that go back in the books a few hundred years. And hip hop is centered around a culture that really can't link itself back beyond slavery. You know, can't always link itself to, you know, a cultural space. And even, you know, for those pro-Black, pro-African hip hop types, conscious music, there was always a problem with that. You know, like there was always kind of an issue with that. Are you really African? What are you talking about in this daishiki? You wearing the goddamn kufi, you know, and talking about how you're really that we all got to go back to Africa, you know. Cats in the street had a problem with that, you know, and it's just part of the culture. So yeah, anyway, I feel like I said a lot about that, but I'm just, you know, I mean, just really looking at this latest generation, I think the persona is the glue between the conscious and some people really kind of consider current hip hop today to be unconscious. And I believe it is that. It has that, it has a lack of consciousness around it. But there's also something very conscious about those people. Good afternoon. And that they're kind of cool. Sorry. Right now. They're kind of cool with everybody, you know. They're kind of cool with everybody. Tyler's kind of cool with everybody. He might talk a lot of shit on records, but he's pretty cool with, you know, people who you'd assume he might have a problem with. A lot of these do. Look at Tekashi. Look what happened with Tekashi. You know, it's like that. That's not even that person is the, you know, that's the poison of the cosign. You know, I mean. That's what happens in the realness versus not. I would much rather have people just fading out on the record and barely legible, you know, in verse and like, you know, than have people try to tell everybody to kind of to continue this narrative where like, oh, you got to be the alpha, who's got the guns, who's that, such and such. I would much rather just have this generation stick with what they know, which is whatever the internet, visual stimulation and ocular focus, drugs, partying. You know, they can't talk about crack era anything the same way that the previous generation could. They can't talk about gangsterism and the beginning of that in the Black community, you know, the way that the current generation could. And some of these cats are pretty scary. They're violent, yeah, but you know, Ice-T used to really rob banks. Ice-T really robbed banks. There's no way, you know what I'm saying? Like, we don't need another Ice-T. We have a lot of Ice-T, you know, there's just enough of that. So.
Yeah, I love all that. It's making me think a lot about how you brought up Lil Wayne and then the way that this essay talks about the surrealists, kind of like the juxtaposition of the real and the surreal. And Lil Wayne, I just was thinking of the quote, "You say you're a goon, but what's a goon to a goblin?" I feel like at the time that lyric came out, what was it, like 07 or something, probably? That was like a part of like a turning point, I think, away from the goon to the goblin, the surreal and just the silliness. And then also around that time, Lil Wayne started laughing at himself in his rap. Like you'd hear him chuckle in between his lines, which was something really I thought that seemed pretty new at the time, and I think it was a sign of the times to come. Um, with the Lils, you know,
Yeah.
the time of the Lils.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
even outside of the littles now because Conway does that all the time. And
Yeah.
Conway is about as far removed from those cats as you can be, but nobody finds their lyrics funnier than, than Conway does.
Oh,
Yeah.
but
Right.
but also with that, like I brought up this part of the essay on page 29 that this makes me think about. Um, I like to read this quote because it also relates to the what you were talking about, Nia, about the youth or the focus on the young and the lack of respect for history or regard for history. Um, and I never thought about it in this way that he made me think about with this paragraph. So he says, like Eminem, the surrealists borrowed the sinister dreams of the oppressed, aspirations for economic success outside of tradition, aspirations for economic success outside of traditional structures, achieved narcissism born to overwhelm self-loathing and inherent existentialism, illusions of grandeur used to counter inescapable depressed circumstances, dismissal of history in order to fashion a new reality in a present tense. And he's talking about the jiggy era here, where Puffy and them moved kind of from the gangster archetype to the business tycoon archetype, the alpha capitalist or whatever, you know. And this was an era, but I never thought about it in these terms of like where I'd always thought of these. Okay, the dismissal of history, the narcissism, you know, the I'm better than anyone else ego, the aspirations for economic success, and he's framing it as a way to escape the oppression of our society on black people, essentially, like as a way to escape the systemic racism that keeps people tra- trapped and not free. Like he's framing it as a way to be free, whereas I'd never, like, I always looked down on the idea of this, the jiggy rapper, but this like made me think about it in a way that gave me like a new kind of sense of respect for that sentiment. I don't know.
I kind of took issue with the negative sort of tip that he had on. Maybe I'm misreading it, but like I highlight and underline certain parts of that because achieved narcissism and illusions brand are really kind of rub me the wrong way.
Mm.
Like I get what he's saying. I don't necessarily like the way he like put it out there though. I don't, and it's
Mm.
because there's a lot of elements like that in this article where it rubbed me the wrong way, but I can't necessarily figure out what it. Maybe it's the very general blanket way he states it, and me
Mm.
taking it personal, knowing that's not necessarily my approach to making hip hop
Sure.
that I take issue
Yeah.
with.
Mm.
I don't know. I was kind of curious to see what other people, if other
Mm.
people took that negatively or not.
Yeah. Um, I personally, when I see narcissism raised today, I tend to feel like it has a place now more than ever when we talk about, self infatuation. Um, Born to overwhelm self loathing and inherent existentialism. Um, I don't know what y'all's experience are, you know, in terms of where you grew up. And we could probably say in general, the blueprint that is rap music, that rap itself is about elevating out of oppression. I think it actually took a long time for Puffy and say Jay to really get into surrealism for real, you know, to get into artists and be really thinking about who. Kanye, probably one of those people too. Now today they name drop those people every 5 seconds. You know, that's what's interesting about this kind of this statement here. However, this is so true. I kind of take it for granted. I mean, it's like we could talk about it, but you know, what happened, at least in the eras prior to Jay-Z and Big and Puff and that era of people, was that, you know, when not everybody had an AR-15 out in the street, you know, before you could get real, you know, weapons that murder lots of people, before you could get military grade weapons out in the street in urban communities, you know, it was, and this is always in New York, it's always credited to Harlem. When deals went wrong in Harlem, they kind of took pride in the fact that they didn't murder people first. You know, drug dealers are getting into issues with each other in Harlem. The idea was that you don't make a mess, because that brings more trouble. It brings heat and cops and everything. You kind of, and it's just money, because you're going to get money again anyway. And even just taking that philosophy, okay, because you can find that in many places in the world, but if we were just to talk about where that comes from in hip hop culture, it may not be exclusive to Harlem, but a lot of the vibe of, you know, the swagger, the fur coats, the minks, the Rolls Royces, the Maybachs, all that really nice, expensive shit, champagne, popping bottles. When the early dealers of Ready Rock or heroin out in the street were doing their thing, that's what they did. They would get their money and rap about it on a record, though. That's the difference. They went and got their money, went and bought a nice car, and would drive down the street and just flag money out of, you know, the drop top. Just let the money fly out the back of the thing, and the kids in the street would run and grab it, or, you know, anybody who was around just run and grab money. And I think that, you know, speaking of that classic era, like Too Short is one of those people who really put it in a song pretty succinctly. There's money in the ghetto. It's not that everybody's sitting around broken, oppressed. That's what kind of always bothered me about, like, sometimes when we talk about the community of hip hop and urban culture, there's this assumption of like classic oppression. Nobody has anything to move. And I think that for many people, this is absolutely true. When you connect with the street music and the street culture, there's something else that happens. You know, you become hyper capitalized. There are people that look better than any of us do, that probably got less money in the bank and everything. And the image is important. That you know, image obsession is part of what's getting ready to get you out of the situation to begin with. Dress for success. You need to look like you're getting ready to run a corporation if you want to ascend to that level. But I think that this is the antithesis of hip hop music, though. You know, it's like there's a cultural proclivity that almost ruins the art form itself. You know, like any art, as soon as people start getting obsessed with attention and validation through finance and how many records they sold and what they look like on the video and that whole 9 yards. Hype Williams was the first person to really make that era look like, make it pop, like make it really look amazing. Like Puff's early videos, Mace, BIG, that stuff, like, to people outside of those places, it was like, you just never see people do it like that. And that's always the nature of street culture, is that it's all about what you're getting ready to do the next day. I'm thinking about those segues in Ghostface Iron Man, where he's talking about, or is it Raekwon's, is it only built for Cuban links, where it's like, oh, wait, no, people aren't even going to be able to fuck with me this summer. Look what I'm getting ready to do. I'm going to take these shoes. I'm going to get this trim on it. I'm going to have it looking like this with a, 3-finger ring. Get the fuck out. Nobody's going to be able to fuck with me in the summer. And that's the nature of this sentence. Kind of simplifies something so critical and important about, at least I would say, just, the Black culture and the Black community. Because even before it was all about selling drugs, and even before the early communities, my grandfather wouldn't have been caught dead walking around in jeans and a t-shirt. He wanted to look nice, okay? He didn't have a lot of money. He was gonna look nice and respectable and have a nice suit. And he wasn't gonna put himself in a situation where he could be disrespected just on looks alone. And there's something within the culture that changed over time. There was a point where we realized, I think culturally, in the urban culture, urban community realized, we got so much more style. Hip hop is an art form of style, it's style masters. And I think when you look at Jay, a kid who grew up in Marcy and sold drugs in the street, got shot at, went through all kinds of little beefs and stuff, and then managed to make his way to being a billionaire today on the strength of his word. Hey, if that's narcissism, the American culture made that possible. Okay, it's not just that you were sitting around, narcissifying and and swaggering and everything. And it's capitalism creates a space where you can do that, where you can be just so important as a person that people just throw money at you. And it's a way that the urban and the street culture has learned to exploit capitalism. It's an exploitation of capitalism. It's also an exploitation of the art form. It's also an exploitation of a person's image and persona too. So that's kind of where I land with it. It's like it's a double-edged sword, and it's a blueprint that's existed for a very long time. And it's just in the modern age just took a different shape. It's hyper real now. It's hyper real. It's hyper real. You can't you can't buy that kind of attention. You could never buy that kind of, that sort of image. You have to build it. Jay had to create that. Puff had to create those images.
I figured out what my problem is with it too, with you talking about image and you kind of talking about high profile and a pride in appearance despite your circumstances. I think that's my problem with the way he positions this, because it's completely absent of the self-perpetuated joyful nature of the escape. Like everything that he puts here makes it sound defeatist on both sides. It's like I'm creating this illusion of grandeur or achieved narcissism because I literally have no other way to escape this incredibly depressed circumstance, where I don't necessarily find that to be the case, because I think back, I kind of think, I'm thinking specifically of Style Wars, the documentary from the real early 80s, late 70s, when New York was still the New York that we knew from hip hop. But as messed up as those conditions were, everybody wasn't walking around frowning, people, everybody that they talked to that was a part of the culture was usually smiling, and they were usually very proud of what they were doing. There was an internal sense of pride. And I think he, maybe I'm just pinpointing on this one thing, but it feels like he's dismissing
I feel you on that.
To find joy even in your bad circumstance.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. And that's, if I were to say anything really bothered me, that's what bothers me about it, is it's not the, I mean, we don't, I don't know, I'm not around Black folks who talk about what they don't have a lot of the time. And it's just not, whether whatever situation they're in, I've never grown up around those people, you know, whoever that happens to be. It's not that the community doesn't lament its position or station, lack of power, lack of control, resource, etc. But um, yeah, I mean, I would, you know, yeah, when I think about it, it's like, well, imagine if we called graffiti artists narcissists. I mean, that was kind of what we were calling graffiti artists in the 80s. It's just the culture, you know, the response from, you know, the city governments and trying to clean up the streets by getting rid of graffiti. And, you know, did we, you know, would we also consider those people to be narcissists? Because, you know, and self-aggrandizing to the point where you just paint a whole train with your name on it, and that's what makes you happy for a day. I don't know if I have a pessimism around that. Again, I think that's relaying, I think that's taking the bricks and creating a whole different structure from what you were given. And that's like, so at the, again, at the core of, you know, of hip hop music, like, you know, even how this is written in the language, and this is a problem that I have with academic papers, is this is written for white people. This is not written for Black folks. You know, this is not written for the white cult. This is written for white culture. This is not written for non-white culture. This is not written for people who are more acquainted with vibe and language and have their own codes around the communication. And even when I kind of go through this more and look at the references, Latin references, the Greeks, the Romans, this is something that is really reproducing white culture. And that's actually what this a sentence like this really reminds me of. And I wouldn't diss the writer necessarily, as much as to say, definitely during the time when this came out, I don't think he could have written this any other way. I don't think he could have written this any other way and still maybe gotten the recognition he was looking for in it. And I want to point out that this is kind of a bit of a style thing, even. Like this is actually the writer, you know, this is the writer's, you know, like own way of spinning and styling and kind of styling on academics. This is his own way of doing that. It's just as self-aggrandizing. It's just as narcissistic to believe that you have the objective ground to lay claim to cultures and people, places, and things. And I think he's from Harlem. I think this cat's from Harlem. You know, I'm not saying he's not connected to this, but how it's styled, I think, is meant to get a certain kind of attention and to address perhaps even, you know, the subject on their own terms. And there was a point where I was telling Jonah, like, I think that a lot of people wrote articles about Eminem around this time. I think a lot of people wrote essays and academic papers, but yeah, this is something interesting. This is like this is an academic swag, you know, this has that kind of thing to it. And I think that only, you know, if you don't have to be so literate and academic, if you're really a hip hop head, you can see this already for what it is. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have all the tools to look at this and know what it is. And that's what's super interesting about this, is like in the conversation is already embedded the same kind of minstrel process that that Rux is unraveling, you know, through these pages and through the essay, you know.
Yeah, we should note, we keep saying, we keep referring to the time. This was published in 2003 for the listener. And yeah, I didn't catch in that paragraph specifically, the sort of condescension, but now that you pointed it out, I definitely see what you're talking about, and I agree that it runs throughout the whole essay, whether that's done as a style or whether he really does have a certain disdain for hip hop culture. Um, I don't know for certain. It may
I
be
think
just pronged in that way to.
I think he might be a pessimist from an academic standpoint. I think his problem isn't with hip hop culture as much as, you
Man,
know,
it
he's,
sounds
you know, yeah.
I
Black
didn't mean to
culture.
interrupt.
Oh no, please go. No, please.
It sounds like the problem is with him. It sounds like he's got some really personal hangups, man. Like I don't know if he got. let me not go there. I'm being real petty, but I don't. I hate to say. I don't want to throw out the term self-hate lightly because I don't personally know this cat, and like I had to stop reading it in the middle of it to be like, who is this man writing this article, and look up who he is and what he's done, and he's a very accomplished person. So I don't understand why he's being so reductive of the culture and doing it with this sort of weird glee. It feels like you say academic paper, like he's impressing his academic friends by completely shitting on hip hop culture by reducing it to this very narrow view that just so happens to be the exact same narrow view that gets exploded and amplified on the mainstream level. And it's like you're just really undercutting. It goes back to Jonah's question about like, can an outside influence have an impact on the culture? I think stuff like this is how an outside influence can have impact on the culture.
I think, yeah, you know, it's funny because, yeah, like there are a lot of people who would fight you out in the street if you said something wrong about this cat. I'm just guessing too, because I think that, you
I'm
know,
sure.
he's a part of the Black community, and also I think he definitely aligns. Like his alignment is really on the conscious side of the fence. Really, the question is, what does Carl Rux really rock out to? What does he like to listen to? You
Well,
know,
that's what's
this
so
is,
confusing because he is conscious. He feels conscious, and
yeah.
it feels. It's the same way I feel about Eminem. I used to always joke and say, "I love Eminem, but I wish he would use his powers for good instead of evil." And that's how I feel about this paper a little bit. I, I don't even feel like he has to change any of the points he makes. I would just love even the slightest acknowledgement of the fact that this premise that he lays out isn't the sole existence of hip hop. It's just one aspect of hip hop.
Yeah. I think this has always been the problem with hip hop critique, right? I mean, like, I just feel like this is pretty standard. If it's, you know, just um, that are, you know, and I'm just as guilty. Like, I spin hip hop in my head, how I describe it. And I think that there's, you know, because hip hop is a language so intrinsically connected to the mind and the imagination, you know, as a culture, it's like, you know, there's a, you know, there's a, you know, you can become very myopic as a hip hop fan, you know, and I'm guilty. I'm definitely guilty of that myself. You know, you can become very narrowly focused. I think M was always a lightning rod. So this paper is not the only of its, you know, of its family. I think a lot of people went in on Eminem. I think a lot of Black academics went in on M. I think a lot of people wanted to pick it apart and explain it, and, you know, but at this stage, looking back on this in hindsight, because, you know, just like M, Rux wrote this when he was what? The 2000, that's like his early 20s? Is that not? I don't know. He's 45 now. I just casually looked him up again. He's 45 now. So he was probably in his mid 20s, mid to late 20s in 2003. Like he was young. He was a young, you know, academic. And this was actually a relatively accessible topic and an easy topic to write about if you were really a hip hop head. You had to write, especially past the heyday, like post 99 M. This was an easy target to dig into. I would have been really perplexed if he had written this about, say, LP. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would have been like, wow, really? You really gonna shit on LP like that? Or you're gonna, like, you know, kind of pick this, put you know, plug him in there and use him as an example. But I also wanted to note that within the conscious community in hip hop, you often find the most conservative elements. And you often find people who are walking around with certain narratives about what their culture should be and what the city should look and what the neighborhood should look like and how everything should be, and have the uphill battle and the consistent struggle, right, of having to reestablish this the sanity in hip hop's reality, having to come back and go, listen, this is what's actually sane about this, okay? And I don't, I'm glad this exists. I want to take a segue, just kind of link this to the conscious community, because Lord Jamar, Lord Jamar of the Brand Nubians is one of those people that I think he made me so mad, and it was maybe like 15 years ago. He said something crazy, and especially as a trans woman, as a queer person, the danger inherent in being also a lifelong, dyed-in-the-wool, born and raised hip hop fan. Like, I'm always going to be a backpacker. I'm always going to be a street-oriented person. That's where I come. That's who I am. And to kind of suddenly encounter someone who I've listened to, I don't know how many times. I love the Brand Nubians. I love those cats. And just listening to him kind of try to reshape the hip hop community because he's mad at some white dude who makes money. He's mad at Leo Cohen. He's mad at, Interscope Records. He's mad at Vlad. He's always mad at somebody. He's mad at the gays. He's mad at the queers. He's mad at the little kids walking around skinny jeans. And this is kind of another dimension of that sort of persona, where the defensiveness, especially in Black male culture, the defensiveness of the hip hop culture is kind of intrinsic. It bubbles up a lot. You got a lot of cats who are going, hey, you don't actually belong here. Where's your hall pass? No. This is, you can't just play with this. This is real. This is all important to people. And that's the part I can relate to. But Lord Jamar will go on record and go, white folks shouldn't be involved in hip hop at all. I mean, he doesn't say that, actually. I'm misrepresenting him. Lord Jamar speaks of a hyper-capitalist element in hip hop where everybody's sold out. And they've sold out to white folks, and they've sold out to a white establishment. And they've sold out their families. They've made money on selling drugs, rapping about selling drugs. They probably don't really sell, doing things they probably don't really do. To him, it's all kind of a carnival, carnival. It's all a spectacle. And in the same sentence will also be homophobic, transphobic, and kind of comprise what I would consider to be Black conservatism. And I think that there's a very conservative aspect to what we're reading in Rux. I don't know if you'd identify that way necessarily, but I just kind of feel that sort of rigidity in defining whose culture and what it means and the meaning in the culture and all the sense making that happens in Rux's Black neighborhood and in Rux's Black community is kind of oriented around this story of oppression, the classic conscious hip hop story of oppression, and that is reductive, that is reductive. And I don't know, I don't know who Carl Rux hangs out with, but I just, as far as where I identify as a coming from this community, especially as a hip hop head, and coming from this community as an urban, person. I'm just not that's a different, to speak this way is to be disempowered to some degree, especially out in the street. It's to be knowledgeable, but disempowered. And that's always kind of the rub with the consciousness element in hip hop music, and it's conscious people who really had a problem with Eminem. It was the conscious hip hop heads who were like, no, this dude's not cool. This is all very, it's sensational, salacious, and violent and vile, and I believe that he has approached the same subject with that pessimism.
Pessimism. Okay, I keep thinking of this term Afro-pessimism, which is I've been trying to wrap my head around this philosophy or concept, whatever it is, for like the last year or so. I was just wondering if either of you two are like familiar with it and if you would relate it at all to Rux. And it's really making me think about the first quote, the Frantz Fanon quote that the essay starts with too. Like, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Would one of y'all be willing to expound a little bit on Afro pessimism? I'm not
I
necessarily
can,
familiar.
yeah, I could talk about it. It's I think Afro pessimism is from my own experience and my own exposure to Afro pessimism. It's broad, and it kind of works. It works in it sits in the framework of contemporary philosophy and contemporary Black cultural philosophy, in that to recognize and first of all, when we talk about identities, and I'll just try to break down Afro-pessimism as succinctly as I can, right? So when we talk about descendants, if I say I'm a Black person, or I say I'm a Black American, and I'm a Black woman, I'm a Black trans woman, I'd have to add some asterisks and some little footnotes, right? But in the end, what I'm referring to is a sociocultural body. I'm not referring to my actual body might be signified somewhere in there. We might be talking about a man or a woman, with a certain kind of anatomy, maybe not. Okay, so Afro-pessimism tends to realize and recognize the difference between what's corporal, what's corporeal, what's physical, and what is sociocultural. Because in order to understand slavery and racism, you kind of have to split those things up. When you are trying to represent an individual who has a cultural stigma or a racial stigma, is to kind of create a version of that person that doesn't really exist in their head necessarily, but then over the course of oppression, the cultural language and the way that people will navigate their experience is ultimately to become that social cultural thing, right? And so, whereas Common might rhyme about his love for his neighborhood and the beauty and the stasis of being, in Common, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be reductive, but, Common's way of describing where he's from and who he comes from is, as a proud Black man who's connected to his history, okay, and hasn't succumbed to slave mentality. Lil Wayne is the kind of person who's like, I don't see what the fucking problem is with Trump. He didn't do nothing to me. Okay, so what's the problem? And then get on and capitulate all of this sort of oppression era, condensed slave culture language. Afro-pessimism talks about our inability to escape this deeper relationship with Blackness that has mostly, that really means that we have never actually gotten to be ourselves, that we've never actually gotten to be purely Black, and yet that we are very much Black, but only in the context of what has been created for us within the scope of a white Western world. And so Afro-pessimism is used as a tool. Some people get really into Afro-pessimism and they're like, okay, basically what this means is that Black people have never stopped being slaves. Black people have never stopped being slaves, and we don't have any chance or really any plausible relationship with the dominating culture that even ever gets to equality. So that's not really a thing. Equality is not a thing. There is no such thing as that. And I feel like I'm doing a poor job of trying to just walk the circumference of Afro-pessimism, but I think maybe that might give you an idea of it,
Yeah, I can kind of. I had a feeling that was kind of what it was. I just didn't want to. It seems pretty straightforward by the term, but I didn't want to assume that I was understanding
Yeah.
the term. So my fault. And thinking about that, would you mind presenting that question again, Jonah?
Well, okay. And real quickly, like, Nia, would you say that this is like an estimation of Afro pessimism as a more concise way? Is that Black people have been defined by a racist white person for themselves and for white people. Like, and at this point in history, like, it's almost impossible to
To
escape that
separate it from, right.
definition. And
Mhm.
that's a pretty sad. It's like when I first heard the theory, I was like, I don't want to subscribe to that. That's too sad. But I mean, it almost seems like maybe Rux is kind of on that um, tip with this when he has a passage about Fanon in a quote that starts with the Fanon quote from the Black Skin White Masks book. And my question was just basically, do you think this outlook is shading the way he's conceptualizing race? This idea that, well, this,
Uh,
yeah, go ahead, Chief.
I kind of see points in the essay where he uses that structure of Afro pessimism, and then he almost, and maybe I'm making too much of a reach comparison, but at times it almost seems like he says in order to escape it and become successful, you have to embrace that definition and then exploit that definition
Mm.
at times. Kind of when he's talking about that whole deep narcissism and illusions of grandeur and whatnot. It's like you understand this definition of who you are as appointed to you by the people that essentially brought you into this culture.
Mm.
So you can either fight that definition and be looked at as an outcast, which is a term he throws around very loosely, or you can embrace this definition, become assimilated into the grander culture because you've accepted your role in this culture, and then use that to catapult yourself out of that definition to an extent, you know.
Mm.
So it almost seems like maybe a weird inverse validation of Afro pessimism in there.
I think that's, yeah. And when I first, and just as we've been sitting here and talking, it really set in on me how much this fits into that lens, the Afro pessimist lens. And I use that word pessimism because it is Afro pessimistic. It definitely, and I that, in my opinion, other people might disagree for good reason. I think is arguable, but yeah, it's that again, back to what you were saying, Chief, about the foundational elements of hip hop and where the culture comes from, and really being much too strong for someone like M to to dramatically shift what it is. I almost don't disagree with him, right? Because that's the thing, is where he's coming from and how this is sort of angled. There's a lot about this that is in fact the truth, but or at least how I would interpret it, I would agree. But when it comes to what the argument is over, I don't think it's over minstrelsy or the culture. I think the argument is over the platform, and I think that what impacts what I would say is the urban fan, the urban hip hop fan, rap fan, Black identified fan of hip hop culture, the being engaged in it and being kind of raised in it, is this question of control. Is the question of control, who really controls the culture and what becomes popular and what doesn't. The essay doesn't really stand up so much when I really think about where Eminem came from. If we really did pick apart the reality of it and who pushed Eminem and where he'd be without Dr. Dre. And I made this comment and on the Facebook group, because I'm like, yeah, Eminem was just a great rapper. if it weren't for Dr. Dre, we probably wouldn't talk too much about him. You know, I mean, he would be one of those dudes where it's like, oh, he's really high. This is cool. I could probably bump a few records or whatever. He's got his own persona, blah blah blah. But it took the relationship with an impresario to create who we're talking about right now. And I think if, you know, in some sense, if Eminem had to do it all over again, I think he might make a lot of different choices, actually, considering where his career is today. Not that he might want to make less money, but how he related to his persona or aspects of what he was doing at certain times. And I don't think the early era he would have necessarily changed, but some things in the middle perhaps. But the same way I think Carl Rux might really kind of shift how he constructs these arguments today. But to me, this is pretty, like, this feels Afro-pessimistic. I got that vibe from it. And I don't think I think that if you believe Afro-pessimism is the only lens by which to view other cultures or your own culture, or, you know, then that would be a mistake, because Afro-pessimism is a tool. It's a tool. It's a sociocultural tool. It's a deconstructionist tool. It's a way of really looking at perhaps not like an objective truth, but the variety of subjectivities that create Blackness, and where that ultimately has come from and where it's sourced. And what's missing in this for me is that this is it is very much a two-way street in hip hop music and the culture. You don't just have people. It's not just that, you know, a couple Chinese cats came over to the States, saw people breakdancing, started breakdancing too, took it back to China, and now they're just controlling breakdancing, and nobody else. They've ruined the culture because of breakdancing in Beijing and Chongqing and Xi'an, and, you know, that's not the reality, right? And it's not that, you know, I don't think that rappers coming out of Russia, you know, like, you know, native Russian, white Russian rappers are pretending or co-opting hip hop culture. And I don't believe that, you know, the European interest in hip hop music has the same kind of relationship that we kind of take Eminem and put him and plug him into this space where he's just the supervillain in this white and black hip hop world, who's learned how to act and speak and talk that way and be the minstrel, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like there's a two-way street. It's that not only did hip hop culture become a part of Chinese culture, that then reflected back into American hip hop as well. Okay, that these are all ways of interrelating and intercommunication between cultures, and the fact that it's hip hop is really important, because it could have just as easily been rock and roll, it could have just as easily been punk, it could have been a number of other genres, you know, but you know, thousands and thousands of people show up at, you know, hip hop shows in Europe, you know, thousands of people in the States, whereas people would never, but wouldn't bother for the most part. People would be, why would I go see, I don't know, why would I go see J. Rue? Why would I go see J. Rue the Damager in 2021 if I'm 16 years old and I've been listening to Lil Pump and Lil Uzi? So why would I really want to be a part of that, you know? There's a way that this is matriculated. It's now like adult contemporary hip hop. You know, it's like that era has become its own echelon in hip hop, and that's kind of the broad established reference through the globe. Whereas locally, where hip hop actually came from, that's been displaced by some other shit. You know, and people's top 5 rappers today is going to look really, really different than mine. It's going to look probably really different than yours too. But that comes, it needed, you know, hip hop needed to be taken by other cultures, because it's even more pure. I go to places in Berlin are bumping like large Professor deep cuts from large pro records that I haven't actually put on my, you know, my techniques for ages and ages. And they're enjoying that. And to them, that is authentic. That's authentic hip hop culture. It's the finest. The same way we would listen to classical music or the same way we would listen to, you know, punk music, you know, like I won't listen to new punk. I just can't. I can't do it, you know. And that's part of the cultural exchange. And so what's really missing is like, this is a very one-sided conversation, you know, and I'd be curious if, you know, if Mr. Rux would, you know, have a different take on this or would double down on it, you know, or have a few different dimensions to it at this point. Cause I think he, you know, he's probably matured quite a bit and has developed a lot of different understandings, you know, since writing it.
Yeah, I'm gonna reach out to him and see if he wants to like make a statement. We can edit in here because he was talking about possibly joining this conversation. But anyway,
Oh,
maybe
that
we
was
should
it.
go ahead.
I did also want a quick qualifier just to say that I'm not even necessarily saying that he's right or wrong per se. I just found it really interesting how strong a response that it elicited from me reading all this, you know, because it's been a while since I felt this visceral response to something like this without being able to voice it clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should make any kind of closing statements we might have and try to wrap it up. We've been here for almost over 2.5 hours, I think. So, yeah, for me, like you're saying, it brought up a lot of emotion, maybe for different reasons, but it was really thought provoking, this whole essay. And yeah, and I'll put a link to it for anyone that actually wants to read it. Um, and yeah, I enjoyed it. I definitely disagree with some of the assertions, and some of the assertions are later contradicted in the thing. So, like I say, maybe it was just meant to be a kind of a pronged thing that is supposed to stimulate conversation like this. But in any case, yeah, um, that's that's my concluding thoughts on this.
Nia, or either way.
Yeah, I really enjoy conversations like this because it gets a bit deeper into the you know, these isometries that we don't really have symmetrical art forms and symmetric relationships in art culture, and that they're quite isometric. There are a lot of differences and gradients of, you know, contact surface between culture, outside, inside, etc. And I love breaking this stuff down because it gets deeper into what is important about hip hop culture, you know.
Yeah. I also feel like people don't even necessarily talk about the culture this deeply anymore. So it is kind of nice to really be able to take a deep dive into somebody with such a strong stance on the culture and just really get back to the root of how does it make me feel? How does it how is it perceived out there on a larger scale? You know, at the risk of reopening the conversation and not to platform this guy because I know folks consider him problematic, but I almost felt like Kid Rock would have been a better subject than Eminem because he
I think
comes
so
from
too. Yeah.
comes from the same place, comes from the same circumstances. 100% used rap to get to the point that he was at, and then the second that he made it past rap, embraced all the problematic elements that everybody knows him for now. So it's
Yeah.
almost like he 100% used it as a stepping stone as to where Eminem has felt like this is the pinnacle that I was going to reach. So even talking about him this way in terms of the culture, I mean, 18 years removed, Eminem's still putting out hip hop music, you know? So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it brought up a lot of thoughts. So I'd love to hear what other people think about this article, should they choose to read it, you know? We should open up a bigger dialogue in the comments if people are down for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Comment,
Please
say something.
comment, write in, whatever. Let's keep this conversation going. Uh, yeah, thank you, audience, for being here, and thank you, Chief and Nia. I'm gonna. All right, bye, audience. Yeah, I'm
Bye.
gonna thank you.